Kojo, Kojo. Kojo, Kojo. Kojo, Kojo. Kojo, Kojo.
India, a land of stories, is what we're going to talk about. I mean, it's such a beautiful, beautiful issue to talk about, and we have some fantastic panelists with us, with an ace moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, Kunal was with us last afternoon in my panel, and I was privileged to have him with me. Kunal Basu, acclaimed author, may I request you to come on stage, please? Thank you very much. A big round of applause for Kunal. হাততালি না দিলে খুব অসুবিধে থ্যাংক ইউ প্লিজ Sharmistha, I don't know how to introduce you because you know what, I'm a huge fan of this book, Bengali Cinema and Other Nation. I got it as a birthday gift on many years back, and I became a fan of your writing on cinema after that. You are one of the most incisive writers on cinema, according to me. Thank you very much for gracing the panel at Arth. Ladies and gentlemen, Sharmistha Gooptu for you.
Kojo, Kojo. Kojo, Kojo. Kojo, Kojo.
The next gentleman that I'm going to call on stage is a very acclaimed celebrity in his own right, and a filmmaker and economist who wears a number of hats. I think his documentary on Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate economist, is one of the finest documentaries in Indian cinema I've ever seen in my whole life. Thank you, Suman. May I welcome, may we all welcome Suman on stage. Suman Ghosh, filmmaker. We have with us Professor Ujjwal Chowdhury, who's currently the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Kolkata-based Adamas University and had been earlier the Dean of Symbiosis and Amity Universities, Whistling Woods and Pearl Academy. Ladies and gentlemen, the ace moderator for this session is Dr. Ujjwal Kumar Chowdhury. Professor Chowdhury, welcome to Arth. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. From dance to storytelling, and I must close the previous dance session by my students telling that they had semester exam till 5 p.m. yesterday, and they will have the semester exam continuing tomorrow 10 o'clock. So within that, they managed to put up the show. I really thank my young students for that. Charity begins at home. Let me come back to our topic. I mean, let's initiate the topic. It's about storytelling. And there are storytellers and who write about storytellers here in the panel. So I would not be taking much time. I would say that stories are told or shared across generations with many purposes. Sometimes it's a slice of life. Sometimes it's a teaching, a lesson, or a morality. Sometimes it's entertainment, and entertainment looked at from various angles. Earlier, when these modern technologies were not there, there was this katha or kathya. That was the original Indian, in religious sense, the way of telling stories. Even today we have Katha Vachak. For example, we have Murari Bapu in Gujarat, who is a very well-known Katha Vachak of our times. There are many in every part of India. So first of all, before actually asking a few questions to each of these very learned panelists, and Sujay just now told me Dr. Chowdhury, but I have to tell that all the three panelists here are the doctors from various backgrounds and universities, which we'll know eventually. But let me begin by asking you, Kunal Babu, to speak first on how do you look at India? I mean, you have been traveling around the world. You still teach in a university abroad. You have spent several years abroad. So how do you look at India as a destination of storytelling, and how stories have evolved over the last 7 decades of independence?
Namaskar. You know, Rajiv Gandhi was the first world leader who banned the satanic verses written by Salman Rushdie. And so Salman's Indian visa on his British passport was revoked. And after that, he gave a very candid interview in The Guardian in which he wrote, you know, this is terrible for me. It's terrible because every year I go to India and I come back with a sack full of stories. And he said, now my sack is going to be empty. You know, the really exciting part of being an Indian and being a frequent visitor to India, that I am, is that this is a country which is teeming with stories. And sometimes you wonder why that is the case. Why is it that we Indians are so attuned into story making and storytelling? It is because, I think, we Indians are a deeply romantic people. You know? And I don't necessarily mean romances between two partners, but romance as in imagination, as in fantasy, as in daydreaming. So wherever you go in India, people will share stories with you. In a train station, in a bus stop, in a tea shop, in people's living rooms. And these stories become the fodder for great novels, for stories, for great cinema. And I would just say one other thing, Ujjwal, if I may, is that stories are what binds this country of great diversity together. Remember, every community has its own stories. So we talk about Ramayana and Mahabharata, but in the same breath, we talk about the Jataka tales of Buddhism. We talk about the Arabian Nights, and of course the Mughals, who are tremendously influential in terms of our story making and storytelling culture. And these stories have brought really people of different religions, faiths, and communities together. I was just chatting with Sharmistha before we got on stage, and can you imagine that Mughal-e-Azam, a great film classic, was enacted by Dilip Kumar and Madhubala. So basically, the different cultures and different faiths and different communities have come together to celebrate the stories of India. That, to me, is the most redeeming part of storytelling in India.
That's a good start. Redeeming part. And the sack full of stories that you spoke about earlier. Sharmistha, you have been writing about stories of cinema. Particularly, you're a very well-known cinema historian. How do you look at India as a destination of stories, both on celluloid and beyond celluloid?
Yes, so obviously, as Kunal said, we are very strong on storytelling, right from ancient times to now. We've been very strong on storytelling, and our films in Bengal, films for a long time were called Boi, which is, another name for story. So our films have actually been really strong on storytelling, and I'll talk a little bit about about Bengal. So even when Uttam Kumar and Suchitra Sen, they were the top stars in the 50s and 60s. They were the top stars of Bengali cinema, and in Bengali film history there have not been such stars. But even at that point, the story was a parallel hero for Bengali films. So Bengali films have always been very strong on storytelling, and historically actually right from the 1920s and 30s onwards, that is how actually Bengali filmmakers distinguished themselves from Bombay. That was Bengal's USP, that we are very strong on stories. We draw directly from literature, we are very strong on stories, and that is how they actually, Bengali filmmakers often set themselves apart from the Nach Gana, we are very strong on stories. So our films have been, not only Bengal, everywhere actually, even Bombay, we have been very strong on storytelling, and whether you can read, you cannot read, you go into a film theater and you enjoy the stories, the storytelling, so we
Great.
have been very strong on that.
So from Indian storytelling destination to Bengal specific, Anshuman, how do you look at India/Bengal, now that she has brought that topic, as destination of storytelling? Your opening comments before we get into bigger things.
See, I wouldn't confine myself to Bengali cinema as such, but because I'm a filmmaker, cinematic storytelling in the last few years in Indian cinema has changed so much from the standard Nautanki or Jatra type of storytelling, which was so popular in Hindi films and Bengali films and whatever, and nowadays I see, a film like Super Deluxe, which came out last year, and, films like Thithi, the Kannada film, they are trying to bend the, storytelling, the ways of storytelling in so many interesting ways. Even in our hometown, Srijit Mukherjee's Chotushkon. It was a wonderful attempt of, weaving four interrelated stories together. So I think it's a very rich time for cinematic storytelling, where other forms of cinematic storytelling is accepted by the audience, not only in India, but even internationally. Yeah.
There has been an attempt in India, I mean, it's there abroad for a long time, to tell multiple stories in one time frame, and particularly for the moviegoer, in one single visit to the movie, like Das Kahaniya. And there have been many other similar examples, both in Bangla and Hindi. How do you look at that, this experimentation?
Very good, since you mentioned, because not even Das Kahaniya, I mentioned Super Deluxe because this interweaving storyline, people say it started with, the classic called Amaros Peros by Alejandro Inarritu. But even before that, a director called Michael Haneke had a, film called 91 Fragments of a Chronology of Chance, I think. And this interrelated storyline, it's not, it gives a somewhat a cosmic reality, or almost a metaphysical sense of the world, where everything is related, and that, philosophical connotation is so intelligently used these days. That's why I mentioned a film like Super Deluxe or Care of Kanchipuram, another movie. So Indian cinema has also, developed this interweaving storylines very interestingly.
Great. I'll come to you, Mr. Kunal Basu. As we all know, Indian author of English historical fiction, Kunal Basu, his 2 short stories. In fact, before I get into that, I must inform everyone, almost 7 English novels, 4 Bengali novels, 4 new ones coming, and 1 collection of short stories, if I'm not wrong. So among these 2 short stories have already been turned into films. So everyone has seen Japanese Wife. I'm sure Japanese Wife is quite common here. So that's Kunal's story. And secondly, The Magic Loom. How do you find the story evolving from the written word to the celluloid? How's the difference? Comment on that.
Let me pick up on Shuman's comment. This has been a substantial change in my lifetime in the relationship between fiction and film. So several years ago, I was watching a television interview of Karan Johar. And Karan Johar was being asked, what are the challenges faced by cinema in Bombay? And he said, we'd love to have some good stories. How do we find good stories? There's a real shortage of good stories. What struck me is that there was a big vacuum. There was this big silence between writers and filmmakers. So filmmakers, by and large, never read books. Okay? And so in this country, Kotha Shorit Sagar, a land, an ocean of stories in India, this acclaimed Bombay film director was finding a poverty of stories, okay, which was ironical. Okay? So what has changed, and in the context of The Japanese Wife, let me tell you a brief story about The Japanese Wife. So how was the story born? Many, many decades back, when I had no intention of becoming a writer, no intention whatsoever, I was a political activist in the 70s in Bengal. So if you know 70s Bengal, you would know what kind of activism that was. And I was traveling in a village, and a friend of mine said, see that elderly man standing there at the jetty? He has a Japanese wife. And I said, that can't be. I mean, in a city like Kolkata or Mumbai or in Delhi, you can find people with foreign spouses. But in a village of India, somebody who's married to a Japanese woman, okay. And this was the starting point for me in writing The Japanese Wife. I had no idea that anybody, any filmmaker, would find it remotely interesting to be made into a film. When one day, I coincidentally met Aparna Sen in Oxford, the city where I live. And she said, I would love to make a love story. Except that all love stories have been written already. Romeo and Juliet and all of that, it's all written. And I wasn't pitching a story to her. I said, but wait a second. I think I've written a love story which is different. She said, okay, tell me. And I narrated the story to her in about 10 minutes, and she was immediately hooked. Now, that was an accident. So what Shuman says is actually hugely encouraging to us lowly writers that perhaps filmmakers are paying attention to our work.
Great, great. But in general, do you find that most of the stories which have come from good novels or short stories made into films. Have they done justice to the original writing, or is it possible to do
Look,
justice
a
completely?
piece of literature and a film are completely two different artistic experiences. So when, for example, in The Japanese Wife, Aparna Sen asked whether I would want to be involved in the screenplay, I said no. It's your work, it's not my work. I have exhausted my passion writing this story. Now you must use your passion in making the film. So for some people, the book works better than the film. For some people, the film works better than the book.
You have written largely on historical topics and contexts, which we find in our history books turned into novels in some context or the other. Or one of your, not the 4 books that you are launching now, the last one which you launched, Kolkata, was on the life of a contemporary story of a gigolo, life of a gigolo in Calcutta. How do you traverse to this? How do you relate? How do you come out with a completely different theme when you wrote Kolkata?
I think I have chemical imbalance in my brain. It's because, look, I'm a variety seeker. And I like unfamiliarity and strangeness more than familiarity. I've watched some of Suman's films, and I think he's the same. I mean, he likes strangeness more than familiarity. And so, going from one story to another, from one novel to another, I look for, and I'm excited by different contexts, different kinds of stories, different kinds of worlds for me to explore. My own world is boring. I'm a middle-class Bengali, grown up in South Kolkata, gone to a reasonably well-known school in South Kolkata, studied in Jadavpur University. Very boring, very ordinary. So I must seek my excitement from worlds that are remote and different from mine.
That's a good way of presenting it. Okay, you had a very nice, interesting background. Your father has been a publisher, your mother has been an actress and a writer, and both have been activists in left movement and revolutionary movement in this country. They have a worldview of their own, which must have influenced your worldview. So how do you connect this background, this lineage, with the work that you do and the education that you do as an economics professor in Oxford?
Well, I've been incredibly fortunate. I grew up in a house full of books. If you look at the walls of our home, and even today, there are bookshelves and bookshelves and bookshelves. Okay? And our house was full of conversation about books. We're a very bookish family. Even now, when our daughter comes home to visit, and my wife and I, we are forever talking about books, and we are arguing and quarreling over books. Okay? So I'm sure my upbringing had influenced my literary taste, but also, generally speaking, my perception about the world and its people. And the one constant factor from my childhood that permeates till today is the sense of compassion for fellow human beings.
That's compassion comes from that background, indeed, when you look at dreams of a socialist world. Moving on to Dr. Sharmistha Gooptu, who has a rare PhD in history of Bengali cinema, but also has done it in Chicago. Interesting, connecting Chicago with Bengal. You have written extensively about historical facts when played into stories brought into cinema. So there have been a lot of controversies. You have written about Mangal Pandey earlier. You have written about Mughal-e-Azam. Recently, we saw a controversy on this one, Rajputana, and before that, Padmavat. So how do you look at this? Do you really have to be historically correct in cinema? What's the role of extended reality or imagination, imagery? If you could comment on that. History and cinema, the connectivity.
Yes, so when it's popular cinema, like you just mentioned Mughal-e-Azam, you don't really, you don't really have to stick to the history books. It's the director's imagination, it's myth, history, a combination, and there was Jodha Akbar, that film Jodha Akbar. Who knows? The king, the emperor, he traveled for months on end. He did not see his wife for months on end. He has so many wives. Who knows if there was, and this is a very, a bourgeois kind of romance that they depict in Jodha Akbar. He has this one woman that he's in love with. Did it even work like that then? So we don't know those things. So obviously it is the director's imagination put in perspective irrespective of the time that the director is working in. I mean, we want to see a certain kind of romance now. You know, we don't want to see the emperor with his 100 wives. You know, we want to see him with one woman.
Is that a middle class bias that we see in the cinema? Because the viewers are largely middle class. Neither the very rich are addicted to cinema,
Why
nor the
middle
very
class?
poor.
I mean, it is the modern idea of romance. One man, one woman. So, you know, so it is the director's imagination. So I think, you know, when you're making a popular film for a, you know, a popular audience, I mean, so, I mean, it doesn't really, the question, what we historians, you know, the footnotes and the sources, obviously they're important. It's important that you do your research, but it's not like a history book. So sometimes I think we do forget that, and obviously there are you know, there are interested parties and interested groups when there's some, you know, an agitation against a film. But also we historians also, I think, tend to forget that when we argue that, oh, Mangal Pandey, you know, the film is not true to. There was a huge the huge historical debate in the pages of EPW in which I participated, which you read. And so a certain historian said, you know, this film, it doesn't say, you know, it's wrong here, it's wrong there, but it's a film. It's a popular film for a popular audience. So history, it's not a history book. So I think it's very important to remember that.
So great. That means you don't have to stick to strictly the historical facts. It's more of the imagination and the way you present it, the way you tell the story. Taking an extension of that, the Bengali psyche is very football loving. You know, Bengali society in general. I remember I fought, the first time I broke my head because I was fighting on behalf of East Bengal with someone who is a Mohun Bagan supporter. Now, that was in class 7. So, I would like to ask you, how has Bengali cinema been truthful to the Bengal's fascination of football?
Okay, yes, there have been several football films, and Dhoni Mein is one, which was very popular. Yes. So the thing is, that striker, yes. Yes, Moti Nondi, yes. So obviously someone like me who is absolutely miles away from sport wrote a paper on football films just shows how powerful the football and film connection is. And obviously everyone knows that Shob Khelar Shera Bangalir Tumi football, everyone knows that song. So yeah, I mean, football has come into films. It's a powerful connection. And yeah, I mean...
So if football is there in Bengali cinema, there is underworld in the Hindi cinema. While the underworld appears to be weak in the Bengali cinema. The Dubai connection of Hindi cinema is very well known. But we do not have that sort of a Dubai connection of Bengali cinema. So do you think that it's the psychology, the social psyche that does not encourage storytelling of the underworld in Bangla?
Yes, I mean, yeah, I'm not really, yeah, I mean, you know, the Dubai connection came into Hindi films because obviously there was, you know, the Dubai connection was there. There was no such similar parallel connection here. There was there was that underworld, the Dubai connection there.
You have written a lot on both Bangla cinema and Indian cinema in general. And these terms keep coming, Bollywood, Indian cinema, regional cinema. How do you, you know, new wave cinema, how do you really interpret these terms?
Yes.
What does justice and what doesn't?
I mean, a lot of film people are very against this use of the term Bollywood. You know, Bollywood, Tollywood, Kollywood, they don't like these terms. They keep saying that, you know, talk about us as Bombay cinema or the Bombay film industry. So they are against using these terms. And obviously, you know, for a lot of people, you know, when you say Indian cinema, they tend to think it's Bollywood, but obviously it's not Bollywood. And recently I was talking to Srijit Mukherjee, and we had, you know, this conversation that, you know, how people still seem to equate Indian cinema, more so abroad, with Bollywood. But it's obviously not Bollywood, it's regional cinema, it's Bengali cinema, it's you know, Tamil, everything else. Tamil is still more powerful. It's,
so Indian cinema is more overarching and more...
Yes, obviously, yes.
The only fiction that you have written in a maze of large number of historical writing is the Menuka has hanged herself. Can you speak a bit on that? How has your understanding of cinema and literature impacted upon when you are yourself a fiction writer?
Yes, so Menuka has hanged herself is my first fiction. It's just been released, and It's set against the film industry of the 1930s, and it comes out of the research that I've been doing for the last 15 years on Indian cinema. And this book, Menoka has hanged herself. It's set in the 1930s against the backdrop of the film industry in Kolkata. And at that time, two kinds of women used to come into cinema. One, the very elite, cultured lady of class like Devi Karani or Shadhana Bose. Ladies from big families of culture and class who would come into films, often with their husbands, knowing that we are doing a form of art. And the other kind of ladies, women who used to come into films, were women of the performing or courtesan classes, or basically, you know, just poor girls who did not have, you know, who just landed up in films, you know, for a livelihood. So there were these two kinds of women in films at that time, and there was a big social divide. Even in the studios, they did not speak to each other. And Kanon Devi, who was a big star of that time, she mentions in her autobiography that I greeted a colleague who was a lady from, you know, a high-class lady also working in films, a colleague in the studio. I greeted her saying, "Namaskar, bhalo achen?" And she turned her face away. So there was this huge divide between the ladies at that time. And in my book, Menoka has hanged herself. There are these two women characters, you know, modeled on these two kinds of women who would come into films at that time. And what I bring out is a very unlikely friendship which actually develops between these two kinds of women, which might not have been possible in any other field, because there was no chance for such women to come together socially. You couldn't have met in a party, you couldn't have met anywhere else. But the film industry was a melting pot where such an unlikely friendship might have been possible, and that is what underlies this book which I've just published.
Great, thank you. Yes, Suman. You have 9 films and 1 documentary on which Shuja has spoken about earlier. And 9 films, and 2 are coming. 9 films with a huge diversity of themes or stories, if I can tell. From Podokkhep to Shyamalankal Turns of the Lights to Kadambari. I mean, quite a diversity. How do you select your stories to begin with? And how do you deal with such a diversity cinematically?
I think I'll go back to what Kunalda was saying, that for stories, most of my stories are from real life. And though I don't live in India, but when I come to Kolkata or anywhere in India, you just walk around and you will find stories, like Kunalda was saying. So, for example, since you mentioned, you know, Shyamalankal Turns of the Lights, that was based on a real incident of an old man who is an ex, or not ex-Marxist, but who is a Marxist, and who gets irritated by so much of so-called lights in Calcutta and wants to turn those off. And my story is about, there's a road in North Calcutta called Raja Monindra Road, where this person finds that even after the daylight, the lights are on. And it turns into an obsession to switch those lights off. And the story is based on that. And it was the person who acted in that role, it was his incident. He was my father's friend, who is 80 years old. And that was my inspiration. I thought that what a metaphor of, you know, of telling a story. Exactly, social, political. But, you know, the film is very simple. It's just basically an old man and his obsession to turn off the lights. Then, you know, of course, Kadambari was a historical piece of work. And going back to what Sharmistha was saying, you know, it is hugely based on the writings of Rabindranath Tagore and also Sunil Ganguly's Prothom Alo, which, you know, it is probably not historically 100% accurate, but it is a historical fiction roughly based on true facts, but very tastefully, you know, written compared to some other writings. So, Kadambari was different because it was based on existing literature or existing facts. Similarly, you know, Podokkhep was roughly based on my father, who is an old, you know, retired old person now, and Soumitra Chatterjee plays that character. And so all my stories come from different sources. Another story which I have told before was called Nobel Chor, where Mithun Chakraborty plays the character. And it came from an article in the New York Times, where, you know, one fine morning I read an article that, you know, one of Descartes' letters were found by a very commoner in Philadelphia who was working in a library. He was not a librarian also. He found the letter, and it was a very, very important piece of letter in the sense a lot of his research stopped because that was not found, that connection. So now this man finds it and he doesn't know what to do with it. He goes to the librarian and the librarian says, oh my God, what have you found? And you know what they did subsequently, I think it was transferred to France or whatever, but you know, the seed of my story of Nobel Chor was from that article where I thought that, you know, Rabindranath's Nobel has been stolen and a lot has been written and a lot of hue and cry over the country, what will happen, and again, it has so much of metaphorical value. What if a villager who just doesn't understand what a Nobel Prize is, doesn't understand or doesn't care who Rabindranath is, finds the medal which is lost? And what will be his journey? Everybody is saying that it's extremely valuable, but to him it is a piece of gold, and he cannot sell that gold anywhere because, you know, he will be caught, that as if you have stolen that. So my inspirations have come from, you know, normal, observing normal life in Calcutta or elsewhere, from New York Times, from an article in New Yorker, which Aadhar, my Hindi film, is based on. So different sources gives me inspiration for my stories.
You know, that you talked about the stories. Let me also related thing. Each of this story is being portrayed through certain characters, and behind each character is a performer. And the diversity of performers that you have worked with is quite a bit. From Soumitra to Mithun, he just said, and I know Parambrata also, you worked with him. From Aparna to his daughter, to her daughter Kankana, and Nandita. So you have worked with very diverse background artists. How is it about, you know, as a director, how do you interpret your working with such diverse talent?
Yeah, I think I'm very, very fortunate of, you know, as you mentioned some names, and also I should mention, you know, actors of the caliber of Shashwata Chatterjee, Sudipta Chakraborty, which, you know, I believe that they are the finest in the country, though they do Bengali films primarily. Shashwata obviously, you know, captured a lot of hearts with his portrayal in Kahani. You know, Sudipta Chakraborty, Rituparna Sengupta, who was here. So I have worked with different genres of acting also, because, you know, from Soumitra Chatterjee to Nandita Das to Konkona, and, you know, have different varieties of it. And, you know, what I learned, or my experience of working with them, is that it's an enriching experience for me, first of all, and the different techniques that everybody has in, you know, performing. But the commonality which I observe in all of them is, you know, because I think a good performance comes when the directors and the actors' thought process, eki shure badha ba eki tare badha jetake bola hoy arki. Yeah, and, you know, my trick or whatever it is with, and I might give credit to all of them because these are legendary characters, Soumitra and Mithun and Soumitra Chatterjee, Mithun Chakraborty and whatever. You know, if they observe a sincerity and the right passion and dedication from a director, they will just give up themselves to the director. And the main goal is to understand what the director's vision is and to submit to that. And I have been extremely lucky that, though some of them are big stars or whatever, Aparna Sen, I worked in my last film, you know, that passion for their acting, when you can, you know, get to the root of that. And of course, there are different ways of getting to the root of that. Most of them are very close friends with mine, so I know how to, you know, rightfully incite their passion.
You know, very
So,
dumbed
yeah.
down, very dumbed down, you know, statement
Right.
on this by Shah Rukh Khan, that we are all Madari ka bandar.
Right.
Madari is the director. How much do you subscribe to that?
I don't think so. I think for me, you know, what I do is I go halfway, in the sense that, so when I'm taking a Soumitra Chatterjee or Konkona, these are, you know, superlative actors and whatever. So, you know, I give half instructions about, you know, I have my vision for the role and whatever, but I leave enough space, because that is the magic which
improvise?
creates a character. To improvise or get stuff from that rather than this and this I want and whatever. And I intentionally do that. I go halfway and keep that. Of course, what they do, if I don't like, they are nice enough to accept that and, try to accept, my ideology, my vision. But what I have found is that this jugalbandi between the director and the actor, if you give enough space
like
to them,
that jugalbandi,
yeah,
right. That's much better.
It elevates to a different level. So I have,
Agreed,
done
agreed.
that with all the actors I have worked
Time's
with.
limited. Last question to you. You are making, or rather, you've already made, is going to be released, a Hindi film, the first Hindi film of your life, and a very experimental Bangla film. Can you talk about them a bit?
So very briefly, so my Hindi film is called Aadhaar. It is based on the Aadhaar card. And it is a
Very timely, is it? With
sort
NRC
of.
around?
Sort of. So it is again based from an. Since you asked me from where did I get the story, it was an article in the New Yorker, which I read in 2011 when the Aadhaar card started, and it was a non-fiction piece on the Aadhaar card, and the first paragraph started with, about the biometrics when the government officials were trying to take the fingerprints of the villagers. And a farmer didn't have the fingerprints because years of toil had eroded his fingerprints.
Very good.
And, so then, and it started with that and then went on to what is Aadhaar and blah, 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 Nandan Nilekhani and everything. But that caught my imagination that, this project is going to take India to digital India and whatever it is being. But this is the reality of India where 80% live in the villages and and this person didn't have fingerprints to begin with. How will you do the biometrics for this person? Yes, and that triggered the idea of Aadhaar, where it is the story of a poor villager who lives in Jharkhand, who is a potter. And similarly, doing pottery has eroded the fingerprints. And he takes the Aadhaar card, and then what happens? It's a sort of humorous journey.
Indeed. You talked about the biometrics. 70-80% of Indians do not have their birth certificate or their parents' birth certificate.
Right.
And there could be problems around that.
Similar type of issues. And the last film which you mentioned, it is a very personal and poignant film. It's in Bangla, though it's called Searching for Happiness. It is my gift to my daughter, because my daughter is 7 years old, and whatever films I do, she's not interested at all, like Kadamburi and Boshu Poribar and Aadhaar and whatever. So, she wonders that what am I doing, like going to India and staying. So, a small incident happened where last year when I was at home in the US, she was inflating a balloon on which she drew a smiley. And, told me that, Papa, kiss this. So I kissed it, asked my wife to kiss it, and then she went outside. So we live in an 18-floor apartment. And then after a while, she and her sister came back and frantically searching for something outside the window. So I said that, what are you looking for? So she said that I'm searching for happiness. So then I stopped and said that a 5-year-old girl saying such a loaded statement, either something is wrong or what is that? So then I found out that that balloon, she has named it Happiness, and she has floated the balloon. Apparently that balloon will fly all the way to Calcutta, spread happiness to Dadu Dida, and all over the world it will spread happiness and come back to here to the US. And after, that thing, she finds that it is lost. Her happiness is lost, and the film is about the journey of this little girl going around in Kolkata trying to track happiness. So
very nice experimental story. We'd look forward to that. But Kunal Babu, in a time when people are reading very less, publishing is, in spite of so many literary fests, which are often more fad than reality, the people are reading less, publishing less, and you are launching 4 books at the same time. Could you speak on briefly, I know the time's up, could you very briefly speak on the 4 books which are coming?
Do we have time, or are you going to scold me?
No, I'm not going to scold you, my friend, but you can speak briefly, no problem.
1 minute book. So there is a novel, a new English novel which is coming out called Sorojini's Mother. A new Bengali novel coming out which is called Angel. An English translation of a Bengali novel of mine which is coming out which is called The End Game. And there's a Hindi translation of an English novel of mine which is coming out which is called Chitrakar.
Kunal needs Netaji Indoor Stadium to launch all these books, I'm telling you.
So,
But I'm very glad.
I had a couple of questions also for you, but I think
Yes.
Sujoy's presence means you guys shut up. So we'll shut up. My purpose was not to speak at all, but to make the three panelists speak about stories, both in literature and on the screen, and how they have evolved, and how their personal journeys have evolved. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Is there any question? Because I can take 2 questions, I promise. Okay, so the gentleman here. Just a sec. You've got a chance to speak. I'd like to like the first question to be asked by the gentleman there. Nishchoy. Sure. One more question allowed.
My question is for Sharmistha ji. You just mentioned that the directors are not stick to the historical script in case of historical movies, right? So don't you think that we are spreading, we are telling history in a wrong way? Like for example, in movie Bajirao, right? So in that movie, what they have shown that he was ready to leave his Peshwe path for Mastani, which is not actually correct, right? So what is your take on that?
Who knows who was Bajirao and who was Mastani at that time? You know, history is often written selectively. You know, when historians, when you go to the library, when you look through some documents, what you write is often depends on what you find. You know, history writing itself is a selective process. So what is right, what is wrong, this is a very difficult question to answer. And, the difference between history and film is a work of fiction, unless it's a documentary film, of course. For instance, I moved from being a history writer to a fiction writer. And the difference between history and a film, a mainstream popular film or a popular book, is that there is room for emotions, imagination, affect in a popular film or a story. So that is how it's different from history. So there your emotions come in, your imagination come in, and it does not always have to stick to what is written in the history book.
And anyway, people watch Bajirao Mastani to look at Ranveer Singh and Deepika Padukone, so it's okay. Yeah, the next question.
Hello, yes. So, as a storyteller is here, and obviously I'm just, your book has been made into a movie, and say it's made by some eminent director, and you find that the main viewpoint which you wanted to express has been lost in translation to a movie. How would you feel? Thank you.
Well, I've been very fortunate. The Japanese Wife was made by Aparna Sen, and both of us were exactly akishure bandha in terms of the understanding of the core premise of the film. A director obviously has the license to depict the story in her or his way. But if that connection is broken in terms of the essential aspect of the film, then that would be a disaster. Well, I've been lucky so far. But in the future, and some of my other writing is now being considered for films, I may not be as lucky. And if I'm not lucky, I will scream. I'll write articles in the press. And I'll come to literary festivals and I will denounce directors, but I hope I never have to do it.
Thereby make the film more popular.
I mean, Shunilda never liked what Manik Babu did out of Arunyadin Ratri.
Arunyadin Ratri,
He
yes.
was vocal till his last breath. I mean,
Yeah.
every interview said that he's never liked Manik Babu's interpretation of Arunyadin Ratri. In fact, to close on this note, I would also like to point out something. With so much of stupid hoichoi around, India is a land of Kama Sutra. Nobody does a proper erotica here. There's so many erotic tales and love stories around. Nobody tries on that hands also. I'd like to have an offline discussion with Sharmistha about this and all of you, that there is no proper erotica after Utsav was done. Utsav was a very political film, but yes, a political erotica. So there's nothing on those lines that India thinks about. Sorry? Kama Sutra, yes, but then what? It just stopped.
Yeah.
You know?
You've planted an idea, Shujat.
Sorry?
You've planted an idea.
I've planted an idea. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. A wonderful panel. A big round of applause for them. Thank you.
Kojo, kojo. Kojo, kojo. Kojo, kojo. Kojo, kojo.